Ukraine's parliament has voted against issuing a no-confidence motion against the country's cabinet in an emotional emergency session called in the midst of widespread protests against the government. The Prime Minister and opposition leaders met face-to-face. And RT's Irina Glushko joins us now live from Kiev. Hi there, Irina. So what happened at that parliament session?
Well, true to form, the Ukrainian parliament has started off essentially with a brawl, albeit this time there were no blows thrown around, which they're actually known for. It was merely the verbal skirmish, and when the Prime Minister Azarov took the stage to speak, you could hardly hear him from behind all the yelling and the screaming, calling for resignation of the government coming from the Rada. And yet the Prime Minister has tried to appeal to the protesters and to the opposition's logic. Let's have a listen to his words.
Those who incite you to blockade the cabinet of ministers are absolutely reckless, irresponsible people. The Ministry of Finance is in this building, the ministry responsible for paying wages to all of Ukraine. Stop and think. Teachers' salaries, doctors' pay, emergency services, they all depend on the continued functioning of this government.
Now, the Prime Minister has also added that the government, as well as Ukraine itself, are not thinking about swaying off the course towards getting closer towards the European Union. And he's also called on the protesters who are still out on the streets in huge numbers, by the way. He's called on them to keep it civil and to abstain from violence. But his words were met with, well, you can say discontent from the opposition, who still insisted on calling them traitors. Those words were voiced by one of the most prominent Ukrainian politicians, as well as you can say media persons, Vitaly Klitschko. And the sentiments expressed by the opposition leaders are actually supported by those who are out on the streets. We have tens of thousands of people pouring in to the central Independence Square throughout the day. But the problem with the Ukrainian situation at this point is that what we've been hearing and seeing largely is the reaction of people in Kiev who are, well, for the integration or closer association to the European Union. However, this is not the case in the entire country. And this is what my report is about. European Union flags, burning trash bins, giddy teenagers, and the word revolution passed around like a football. This is Kiev. But what about other parts of Ukraine, where people have a different opinion about what's good for the country and what isn't?
How many revolutions did we have in Ukraine? 7? And what good did that bring us?
They gathered old people and students and used them. It's so unpleasant. I don't even want to talk about it.
Right now, the opposition is trying to sell the drive for EU integration as the choice of all. But recent polls show that there's an equal split between the pro-European west of the country and the east and south, which are historically much more pro-Russian.
If people want to live like they do in Europe, they must work like they do in Europe. They should not ditch school and work for the sake of being out on the street.
To be in the EU, we must meet certain criteria, and at the moment we are simply not up to par to the European standards in the way we produce things.
So far, the Ukrainian leadership has shown no sign of giving in. Quite the opposite. The president, the parliament, and the cabinet remain firmly in place. So perhaps the forecasts of an impending doom could be premature. Irina Glushko, RT, Kiev.
And as Irina just mentioned, the demands of demonstrators in Kiev are not exactly shared by people in the east of the country. Thousands have taken to the streets there to voice support for the authorities and their decision to suspend the trade deal with the EU. Recent polls show the country is sharply divided on the issue. More than 70% of those living in the west of Ukraine favor the deal with the European Union, compared to less than 30% in the east. And earlier we discussed this with political analyst Dmitry Babich, who believes pro-Western activists are simply more active.
Historically, the majority of Ukrainians is pro-Russian, and usually the pro-Russian candidates, or at least the candidates who said they were pro-Russian, won elections in Ukraine. The only exception was the so-called Orange Revolution, when pro-Western demonstrators in fact blocked the government buildings and took control of the Electoral Commission. The pro-Western radicals are much more active. They travel to Kiev at every occasion. They have been bussed in there. They have some financial support from some shady circles. So indeed, I think that there will be more action from the pro-Western part of the country.
One thing, though, both the government and opposition agree on is that the violent riots were deliberately instigated, although each side blames the other. And prominent foreign affairs analyst Dr. Sergei Trifkovich believes the authorities have nothing to gain from such tactics.
It is obvious that the government has nothing to gain by escalating violence. The government is actually hoping that it will gradually die down. The only people who have a vested interest in provoking violence are the protesters themselves, or to put it more precisely, those who are behind the organized aspect of the protests, because it would work wonders both in the Western media and in the anti-Yanukovych segment of the Ukrainian population to have the martyrs of the so-called peaceful protest who are being suddenly beaten savagely by the police. The violence instigated perhaps by the fringe elements of the protesters, but certainly not by the government, because they have nothing to gain.
Several Polish politicians, including the former Prime Minister and the Vice President of the European Parliament, went to Kiev to support the protesters. And John Laughlin from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris says this mirrors the events of the Orange Revolution.
The rumours of a coup are to be taken with some seriousness, but I would be surprised if the events of 2004, the Orange Revolution, could be repeated. I think it would be difficult for the pro-Western forces in Ukraine to pull off the same trick twice. It's absolutely disgraceful for European politicians to travel this way, as they did 10 years ago when members of the European Parliament and other people from the EU, including of course particularly Polish representatives, played a very important role in disrupting the electoral process back at the time of the Orange Revolution. It's very important to emphasize the role of Poles specifically in this process with Ukraine. Poland has always regarded Ukraine as its backyard. It has, I would say, neo-imperialist designs on Ukraine. It wants Ukraine to come into its orbit, into the European orbit, but mainly into its orbit. So there's no incompatibility between Kaczynski's professed Euroscepticism and his deep desire to effect this radical geopolitical change.
And we'll, of course, be bringing you more updates from Ukraine and expert opinion on the situation throughout the day. Plus, you can always keep an eye on developments by logging on to rt.com, where you will also find the most striking videos and photos from the protests.